Do you remind your people about the decisions? Are you following up on their actions? Could it be that you're sitting in a meeting and are feeling like, I don't have the time to explain this even more, and you want to end the discussion, take a decision, and start to take action now? And after the meeting, when you're checking on the actions and the results, perhaps you've noticed that sometimes nothing really has happened. It feels like nobody got started yet. And you're asking yourself, well, didn't anybody accept the decision? It seems like nobody sees the need to start. And perhaps you've started to ask yourself, well, if they only understood the urgency and saw the purpose behind the action, you could all agree and start. But instead, it feels like that there is a gap somewhere. And the gap that I mean is the gap between the action and the purpose. Because even in smaller actions and tasks, we would like to know exactly, we would like to know why we do what we do. So could it be that a good question for yourself to ask now is, well, how do you close that gap and get started? Because this gap feels like you're standing on one side on the river, on the beaches, and your team is standing on the other side of the river. And you have this huge space between you where you don't really understand and make that connection between the actions and the purpose. What would it mean to you if you had a bridge which you could cross so that you could meet your team where they are and help them make the connection to the purpose that you see so that they can start crossing that bridge and taking action? This method you could apply in meetings, whether it's a physical meeting or whether it's an online meeting, if you knew exactly the 5 steps that is needed to close the gap between the actions and the purpose. That is why I call this Close the Gap exercise. It's an exercise that you're going to lead your team, and I'm going to share with you exactly the 5 steps so that you can be sure of taking action in the end and also being sure that the connection between the actions and the purpose has been made. And it goes by the letters C-L-O-S-E, close, for close the gap. The first thing that you will notice when you want to close the gap and connect action to the purpose is that, well, if you're discussing an issue, you have people with different perceptions, different levels of information about a certain issue. Which means that if you want to bring everybody on board, you would want to clarify the background and the status of the question you're discussing. And that is really where it starts. That is the C. Now, you can prepare the background and the status so that you can share that within 2 or 3 minutes PowerPoint, or you can ask somebody else to do that, or even ask your team to share their perspective and their knowledge around the background and the status of the question that you would like to discuss. Be aware that this is not an explanation of why you are where you are. It is just to clarify the background and the status of where you are right now. When you're looking at everything that you have in front of you, of course, now you'd want to change things. So first of all, you would want to think about, well, how are we going to solve this now? This might be a very wide question to ask, because this would invite all the opportunities to think about. And it's not even a question about asking, why did we end up where we are right now? Because that is not going to lead you forward. Instead, your team now needs to learn something. Perhaps learn something from each other. That means you would want to ask a learning question. And the learning question here, the L, is a question that starts with how. How can you avoid X? How can you be better at Y? How can you ensure Z? These questions focus now your mind and your team's mind forward, bringing together all their experience and all their knowledge and all their ideas, and how can we solve this right now? Now for the next step here, the third step, the O, you would want to be aware that when you ask this type of question, that everybody of course would like to contribute, and you know who's going to answer questions first, you know who's the specialist, who knows a lot about these things, but you also want to make sure that everybody who's sitting at the table right now gets the opportunity to answer this learning question. That's why you want to open up for everybody, for everybody's ideas, and collect and note all the ideas. And this is important, and that is why there are a couple of short instructions that you would want to note so that you can instruct your team deliberately how to do this. And here's the first instruction. And you might want to write this down. And it goes like this. Now we know the question that we want to ask. Now we have 3 minutes, and I would like you to think on a piece of paper about as many answers to this question as possible. That's instruction number 1. After 3 minutes comes instruction number 2. Now you have been thinking about as many ideas as you have for this answer, for this question, and now I'm going to ask each and every one to share their most important answer right now. We will do a couple of rounds so that everybody's ideas gets heard. We are not going to have any discussion, any comments, whether things are work, whether we've done it before or whatever. We're just going to collect and be open for all the ideas. Then you write down all the ideas on the flip chart. You don't comment, you don't allow any discussion, you move on, you say thank you for your contribution. What is yours? If people want to pass, you let people pass. And if everything then is on the board, it might take 1 round, it might take 2 rounds. It takes as much time as you give your team to explain what they think is necessary. And then to open up for these ideas, you would want to do a second thing that is very important after you have collected or noted all the ideas, because you would want to understand why did the people suggest what they suggested. So you can ask each and every one more time, why did you suggest what you suggested, so that they can explain themselves out of their experience, how it connects, how it would solve the problem. Understanding each other here creates this sense of unification, of connectedness to this purpose, and shares a lot of experience rather than just listing the ideas. So make sure that you ask each and every one why they made their contribution. Now you've got a long list of things, and naturally there are lots of things out there which are good and other things that you might want to do later. So you would want to take the 4th step here, which is to sort these ideas. That is why you want to sort and prioritize and cluster these things. These are 2 different ways of doing this. You can prioritize, you can let people vote on the top 3 that they find most important, and no, you're not going to vote your own. And when you have the prioritization, you might have 3 or 4 things that are most important right now, or you take all the ideas and you cluster them in 3 or 4 different topics that appear to be logic right now in addressing this question and the issue at hand. At this point, I've seen so many teams be very satisfied at their work, leaning back, looking at the manager and said, okay, now we have done our work as a team, we have prioritized all these things. Now please, Mr. Manager, solve this for us. But that would not quite capture the idea of teamwork, would it? So there's a 5th step here, the E in the close the gap exercise, that you would want to make sure happens right now, so that you don't look at your team and said, well, it feels like nobody decided, nobody agreed on the decisions, there's no actions, so that's why you need to execute on these things. So how would you execute on this so that you can get started? Well, 2 things you need to do. Number 1 is you would want to ask on these 3 or 4 topics, you would ask for volunteers. Who would like to help to solve and move this question forward? chances are that since you've built the bridge now between these ideas, the actions that your team needs to take, and the purpose why it was important to put it up on the board in the first place, now that there's this connection, there's this bridge, you will have much more volunteers around these things where they say, yes, I would like to, I see the need, I see the purpose, I would like to volunteer and contribute to this. The second thing that you would want to be sure about is that your role right now is immediately thank you for the volunteering and offer your support by fixing a meeting within the next couple of days so that you can start coaching and helping the person here who volunteered to plan this exercise. If it's a larger task, you can ask them to repeat what they understood here would be the priority for them and how that is connected to the original purpose. You can ask them to invite volunteers to help them so that they're not on their own, so they can create a little sub-team. But your role is to coach this team, this project leader, sub-project leader, to coach them, to help them plan, to help them find the resources and give access to the time that you have so that they feel this is an important task that your team is going to do so that you can move forward. And this is an important element so that in the end this prioritization doesn't end up on the shelf with all the other priorities that got done once but then never followed up. The E is your task for the future, to make sure that the execution really happens. Because if it doesn't happen, you'll be following up on the activities and you will creating this urgency again around certain activities without really having the connection and the bridge built to the purpose. And as you know by now, that activity without purpose is the drain for any team. And that is why your role as a leader now forward is helping your team to execute on the activities so that they become purposeful and help your team to move forward.